Welcome, everybody, to a new edition of the Maqdisi Street podcast. Sari, I'm joined by my brothers Osama and Kareem. This time it's just the three of us, and we're going to be doing a live stream for our Patreon supporters on the 18th of November. So Patreon supporters can ask us questions in real time, or you can also send post questions ahead of time to the Patreon page, so we can address them. But we'll be live, and you can be live with us on the 18th of November. This time it's just the three of us responding to what's been happening with the ceasefire, sort of quasi ceasefire in Gaza, with the so-called Trump peace plan, and basically where things go from here. It's kind of building on the episode we did last week with Diana Butto. So Kareem, why don't we start with you? What's your take on the Gaza ceasefire, which is beginning to look ominously like the Lebanon ceasefire, where one side ceases and the other side fires? What do you think is going on?
Well, yes, I mean, I agree. I'm not sure. I think we probably need to do a full episode on this, but it seems exactly like what's going on in Lebanon, but of course at a much more dramatic scale, where it's a kind of for show. Where at the very least, I mean, let's say the good news. The good news is that at the very least, the kind of large scale massacres, the large scale genocide, has calmed down over this past week or so. And there's been a bit more relief, a little bit more humanitarian aid and food aid and things like this that come in. And I think just at that level, we have to acknowledge it and say for people there, that's a massive thing. So that's a positive if we want to look for positives. But on the larger scale, yeah, I think I'm not sure how many, but there's there are dozens of people already have been killed, including kids. The Israelis, I think, what's his name? Gavir, Ben Gavir has already come out today. I think I recall today he just came out with another statement saying, now that the hostages are out, we should go back and rain hell onto Gaza again. So, I mean, these guys are going to start agitating. So it's already happening at the low scale, as you said, a kind of Lebanon model where of course, I mean, we take for granted Israelis simply don't abide by any kind of deal of any kind. We know that much. But, they're going to establish the sense of they get to hit what they want. The drones get to do what they want. They get to assassinate or hit whatever they describe as some kind of base or some kind of Hamas fighter or Hezbollah fighter or anything else. They have the right to do so, to police it, to surveil, and to attack without anybody telling them otherwise, in return for the stopping of this mass-scale genocide. I think that's the obvious thing. And in return for basically the Arab and Islamic world to say, okay, great, we'll applaud this and let's finally get to the day after kind of deal, which I think we should come back and talk about this, because I think this is a great deception that's being performed at the moment. What do you think, Osama?
Well, I agree with you, Karim, and I think it's quite clear to me that this is about a whitewashing genocide. Now we're in the phase of trying to rebuild Israel's image, and with, of course, Arab official consent, and with the, of course, U.S. and European EU backing. And the idea is to say, okay, the genocide is over. Not that they ever recognize the genocide, but to say the genocide is over, or at least the most intense phase of killing is over. And now we're into the sort of the normalization of the killing of how many Karim were killed and Sadi were killed over the last week. 100 Palestinians were slaughtered in the last week. It's become so routine to kill Palestinians en masse and to kill children en masse in Gaza, let alone what's happening in the West Bank. As we can see, the pogroms go on, the burning of orchards go on, the assault on the Aqsa goes on, and so on and so forth. All these things are all happening. And so we're in this new phase, and it's a travesty, of course. But as Karim, as you said, at least the intensity of the slaughter has diminished. But it's very hard for me to see in the short term anything but a Lebanon model times two. In other words, the idea that the Israelis could continue to violate the ceasefire at will and kill Palestinians and choke the aid going into Gaza constantly, as well as constantly expanding into the West Bank. And meanwhile, everyone's going to pretend that we're back to quote unquote the peace process. Sadi, what do you think? That's how I see it.
Yeah, no, it's as Diana Butto said last week. As soon as you say the words peace process or peace plan, as she says, it's like a magic pill. Suddenly, Western leaders and audiences and mainstream outlets can suddenly say, "Oh, oh, we're back to happy days. It's a peace process again. So now everything is okay. And yes, there may be some temporary disruption, but don't worry. There's going to be a peace plan and a Trump peace plan and a future and the Abraham Accords and all this other stuff. And obviously that's not all. The real questions are again deferred. We can actually look at the text of the agreement. It's worth taking a moment to do so, although I did with Deanna. But also, it's not just, when they're bombing and killing now. Yeah, so I should say the Israelis are occasionally bombing and they're using artillery fire and so forth. But what they're doing a lot of also, I think most people have been killed this way, is they have an invisible line. Because remember, they haven't withdrawn from Gaza. They've withdrawn from something like 40% of Gaza. And they hold the other 60%. What they do is they've withdrawn beyond a line that's not demarcated anywhere. So people on the ground, especially in a situation where it's a sea of rubble, people on the ground trying to get to their homes don't know that they've suddenly crossed an Israeli line, because there's no way to know that you've done that. And then they just shoot you. And they've killed, I think, at least 40 people so far, men, women, children, trying to find the ruins of their homes to see what's still there, to see if anything could be recuperated. And they cross a line, an invisible line, and then they're terminated basically by some Israeli sniper or one of their sniper drones and so forth. And so, yeah. And then they continue to say, well, Hamas hasn't released all of the bodies of the prisoners it was holding. And so therefore, now we're going to turn off the aid, or we're going to turn on the aid, or maybe yes, or maybe we're going to reduce it, or maybe we're going to allow this and not that. It's back. So you guys raised the comparison of Lebanon. It's like the situation in Lebanon in that the Israelis, one side, as I said at the beginning, one side ceases and the other side continues to fire. But with the added distinction that in Gaza, the siege continues. Like Lebanon is not under siege. Food comes and goes from Lebanon. People can grow things in Lebanon. But in Gaza, they can't, because all of the land has been demolished, basically. And if the siege remains in place, and what's imported is all subject to Israeli control and interdiction. So, yeah, it's, as Karim said at the beginning, if there's good news, it's the fact that they're not killing 300 people a day or whatever it was at the height of the genocide. But it's just shifted gears. It's slowed down. It's changed lanes. But it continues. Unfortunately, it continues.
But don't you think that there is a difference? Well, I think we talk about the Lebanon model, but just in general, isn't there a difference between the Lebanon and Gaza? Not just saying what you said, of course, physically, and the fact that one is totally besieged and Lebanon is not in that sense, but more, let's say, broadly or more politically, the idea that you need, whereas Lebanon just needed to be shut up a little bit and, can go into its own corner. And if the Israelis are attacking South Lebanon and now it's starting to escalate, nobody really cares that much. Where it comes to Gaza, unless that calms down a little bit or goes under the radar, you won't be able to have renewed kind of, I think today the Egyptian head of intelligence went to Jerusalem. And you're going to have a lot more of these kinds of talks to go back to not just the peace process as in Palestinians, Israelis. I don't think that goes very far, but it's much more important for the Trump people that it's more, and for the Arabs, that you end up having Egypt and then the larger Arab world, the Gulf, to kind of, renew those kinds of things that had been totally frozen and made very, very difficult. I think that's what's being kickstarted. You need to have some kind of pacification of Gaza, but not genocide, in order for that to continue. Whereas in Lebanon, it's more connected to potentially to Iran and to something else, rather than the kind of inter-Arab potential for the Israelis to kind of come back into the fold, especially vis-a-vis the Gulf. Isn't that a slightly different thing?
Yeah, it is. But what it suggests, again, is that the Israelis will, instead of killing 300 people, like there's a threshold beyond which they'll be encouraged.
No, I mean politically. I mean in political terms, not in terms of how many they're killing. In terms of, you need for the Gulf Arabs, for the larger Arab Islamic world, to kind of come back into the fold to stop this incredible kind of difficulty, let's say, for them to deal with Israelis in the way the Abraham Accords and this kind of stuff. They needed to have the genocide not to end, but to kind of go off the front pages.
No, that's what I mean.
In order for
Yeah, but that means there's a certain threshold that group of states will tolerate. And the Israelis, as long as they're killing below the threshold, it's It seemed to be under control, all quiet on the Western Front, to use that famous novel's title. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that pros and cons are goods and bads, or rather bads and worses, I guess you could say. So the fact that Jared Kushner and what's his name, Witkoff, and Trump himself all see real estate potential in Gaza, and they have, that's not new by itself, means that they have a personal, they have something personally at stake, the opportunity to make a lot of money on the backs of Palestinians, of course. And so that gives them a little bit more incentive than, say, in the West Bank, where they don't have an incentive because they're not going to make money off a West Bank Riviera, for example. So I think that also adds a complication. So it suggests that maybe, and I think Kushner just went to somewhere to talk to them. Like, I think there are mechanisms there that will slow the Israelis down. But the point is, we're talking about a threshold. And what that means is that the genocide slows down, the siege remains in place, most of Gaza remains under occupation, people are still going to be killed 1 or 2 or 3 at a time rather than 100 or 200 at a time. But fundamentally, nothing on the ground actually shifts or changes, as far as I can tell. I don't know. Osama, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think I agree with you. My point is that we've gotten to a point. It's very hard for me to sort of, as a historian and as a person, it's very hard for me to analyze what is going on here in terms of the extraordinary normalization of the dehumanization and the obliteration of Palestinians that this genocide has affected. I mean, in terms of the killing of so many people, of the starvation of children, all that was routinized by the Israelis. It's true that there was a revulsion around the world, and even, Sadi, as you pointed out many times, in the US and in parts of Europe, there was a general revulsion at this sort of obliteration of children and the starvation and the killing and the open-ended slaughter. But I feel at some level that we need to have a sort of a slightly different sort of, more humility in terms of understanding that we are in this. I mean, this is a debate we've had endlessly, and you guys always accuse me of being, quote, negative, unquote, but I think there's something to be said. Where does the idea of a genocide and then ending, I mean, what does it mean to end the genocide when it goes on and then reward the perpetrators? That's what in essence what you and Karim are saying, is that if the so-called Abraham Accords are expanded. Sorry.
What do you mean we're saying? What do you mean we are saying?
No, in other words, you're saying you're charting, you're predicting that this is what's going to happen down the road, that Syria will soon join the Abraham Accords, and then there will be, the Egyptians and the Saudis will get back into their sort of.
But it's not what I'm saying. It's what there's literally, if you go to Beirut and places in Damascus, there are billboards
that's
literally
say. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm saying you're analyzing, you're suggesting, like, in terms of your analysis of where this is going. I'm not saying you're agreeing with this. I'm saying that you are. But the point is, how do we, as people who care deeply, obviously, about what's going on in the region, how do you analyze this idea of a genocide that just is put on pause for a bit while the complete assault on the Palestinians continues everywhere? So how do we make sense of that, given all our previous sort of history and knowledge of other conflicts, of other genocides, of other situations? That's really what I'm interested in now, not so much in trying to figure out what the nuts and bolts of the Trump administration are, because, in the end, that's pretty obvious.
I don't know, Osama. It seems to me that the main issue here is, I mean, as you said, for example, the Israelis, if the Western world and the Gulf states have their way, the Israelis won't pay us. They won't pay not just a financial price, any kind of political or moral price for the horror they inflicted on Gaza. They'll be able to dust their hands and walk away. But the thing with the Israelis is, we know this from Lebanon, we know this from the West Bank, we know this from the so-called Oslo peace process, etc. They don't stop. There's something in them that they're not actually. They'll keep going, and their pressures they're still the same pressures that were on Netanyahu politically are still there. So I think we're talking about a temporary cessation or reduction in the genocide. But I think that they're, just as we saw in Lebanon, as I said, they're not capable of actually stopping, because they have an internal drive. Yeah.
But in Lebanon, yeah, Sadi, I get your point, but I'm to Karim's point. Karim made this point. I remember the very beginning of this entire sort of genocide on the assault on Hezbollah way back when, in 2023. And Karim made the point that there is deterrence that had been the rule after 2006 had been shattered in 2023-24. And Karim's point, if I remember correctly, from just as an analyst, was saying that there are new rules of the game in essence. And so when you look at Lebanon, you're right. You're saying the Israelis don't stop, but why should they stop? They have basically entirely, as far as they're concerned, they have entirely neutered Hezbollah. There is no more resistance to them. They are at will to do what they were not able to do from 2006 onwards. They're able to do in Lebanon, to bomb, to kill, to drone, to surveil, and there's absolutely no deterrence whatsoever. So in that sense, how do you guys make sense of that? Karim, especially you, with the whole question of deterrence from a realist perspective. I mean, Sadi's saying that they don't stop, therefore they are going to overreach.
Well, actually, sorry, before Karim answers, just with respect to Gaza, Karim can answer with respect to Lebanon also. But with respect to Gaza, what that means is that if there's a certain threshold that the Gulf states and the Western states will tolerate, and Western publics also will tolerate, the Israelis are going to go, we all know they're going to go beyond it because they can't help themselves. That's just the drive that they have. Right. And so what that means is they will, at some point, they're going to turn off, they're going to shut Rafah down or whatever the crossings are altogether. And they're going to resume large scale bombardment. It's kind of, it's scripted from here. But you remember there was a peace agreement or a ceasefire in the spring that they unilaterally just went back to the full scale genocide again because they felt like that's what they wanted to do. And the pressures in them, there's Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. They're not anomalous figures on the fringe. These represent, and we know all those polls coming out of Jewish Israeli society over the past 2 years make this very, very clear. There is a kind of a genocidal push. I mean, the Lemkin Institute said at one point last year, Israel is a genocidal state supported by a genocidal society. That's not me, that's the Lemkin Institute. So there is a kind of push there that even though the Gulf states and the business people and the Western people and the Kushners and all these guys may want there to be a certain threshold beyond which they don't go so that business deals and other kinds of arrangements can be made, not just in Gaza, but regionally, which is what they really care about, because that's where the money is. The Israelis won't, I think they can't restrain themselves because they've never learned the mechanism of restraint. As you said, they've never had to learn the mechanism of restraint. Because no matter what they do, they keep getting aid and support. It's like a child who's never been told no. So
therefore, this gets to Karim's point. I mean, Karim, maybe you want to jump in here, but therefore, how are what we are saying, Sadi, contradicting each other? In other words, you're saying that they won't stop because they don't have to stop, because their internal pressures will keep pushing them to escalate and escalate and escalate, right? Beyond which the certain threshold, I guess the threshold is bombing the Gulf. Bombing Doha seems to be a threshold that was crossed, or the otherwise the Western world is perfectly,
or even in Gaza itself. There's if what we're saying is the premise is there's a threshold beyond which the Israelis are not supposed to go, so they can kill 2 people here and 3 people there and 5 people here, but not 300, and they can't start bring whole buildings down to get whatever buildings are left. And I think they're going to exceed that threshold in Gaza, let alone doing things in other parts of the region.
I guess my point is given the impunity with which they act, what does it mean to exceed the threshold? I don't understand. There seems to be no consequences to them to exceed. You're saying there are. I guess, are you saying there are long-term consequences? Because in the short term, again, Karim, I'm turning to you. In the short term, given the fact that they're able to bomb with impunity in Lebanon and they seem to be getting away with it, and Syria seems to be, insofar as there's any Syria left, Syria seems to be pivoting towards Israel and towards sort of submission to the Abraham Accords dynamic. What's your sense of Sadi's read that Israel is going to overreach, and yet they seem to be, from a realpolitik perspective, they seem to be sort of there seems to be no deterrence on them.
Yeah, well, I agree with part of what Sari is saying on terms of what the Israelis, and I think we need to, I would disaggregate a little bit, and I've done this in other episodes. I think we need to separate the American project from the Israeli project, the Zionist project. I think they come together quite a bit of the time, and then sometimes they go apart in a little bit here and there. That's not to say that if the Israelis push, the Americans won't support them. But I'm just saying in terms of the ideal project, what they're trying to do. And Lebanon, I think, is a case where you have, where the Americans basically are kind of pushing through very hard in what you can say a state building project. They're trying to push through the idea of disarming, which plenty of groups in Lebanon are happy to go along with. So disarm Hezbollah. And kind of create something which basically falls very much under the American, with this massive new embassy that they've just created, this $1 billion+ embassy, which is which I think at the time anyway was the most expensive embassy in the world, and again at the time was the second largest embassy in the world, where Iraq was the first. So you can see that the kind of symmetry in the region. So this American project means that you need to, you want a certain form of stability in order to just kind of keep and exert this American control in that entire region. They don't particularly want to have genocide, and they don't particularly want to have, constant wars in South Lebanon or outside Lebanon. I don't think. The Americans. The Israeli project, this is where I agree with Sari, which is that they cannot, so let's say the Americans succeed. Let's say Hezbollah gets totally disarmed. They get folded in, you go through all of this exercise, which won't happen, but let's say you go through all of this and it works. For the Israelis, that'll never be enough. They will need not only surrender, but total surrender. And eventually they will go back into South Lebanon. They will try to push and occupy South Lebanon again. They will not allow Lebanon to be a functioning state.
Okay, they're in South Lebanon, are they not?
No, I mean,
they're in South Lebanon.
No, they have the so-called 5 points and the 6 points and the 7 points. And they, so they're there, and they've been there. They've been there for since 1982, as far as even 78 or 82, as far as the Lebanese government is concerned. I mean, there's still parts of Sheba Farms and parts of Raja, and these things even after 2006 and after the Israelis didn't. So there's always been bits and pieces of Lebanese territory. So it's not so much the occupied territory after 2000 that was the main issue. It's the invasions. It's the going through the territory, through the drones, through the missiles, through the attacks, through all this kind of stuff. And they're creeping, they're trying to creep forward. They're creating that 3 to 5 to 10 kilometer kind of range in South Lebanon where it's like Gaza. Again, less dramatic, but same idea, where there's a total line of fire, where they will never allow reconstruction. Not that they're allowing reconstruction anywhere else, but really even for the long term, they have no intention to allow anybody into that zone. Near the border, in those 3 to 5 or whatever kilometers. This been totally razed, totally destroyed, and they will never allow anybody there if they have their way. I'm saying it'll go even beyond that, because if they take, let's say, 5 kilometers there, why wouldn't it be 10 kilometers? And if you take 10 kilometers, why wouldn't it be 15? And you keep going. And so you have the situation where, what does surrender mean to the Israelis? I agree with that. I don't think in their very makeup, I don't think they have an idea of when to stop. When do you stop? When do you say, okay, you know what, we've gotten the maximum that we can get, and we will stop? Why would they? They feel that they are on top of the world. They feel that the entire West has supported them. They feel that the kind of basically the Arab world and the Islamic world, or at least the kind of the big actors, I mean, leaving aside Yemen, leaving aside, frankly, Lebanon, leaving aside, some countries here and there, in general, the larger Islamic Arab world has basically said, okay, whatever, just don't do full genocide, just calm it down a little bit.
So Karim, are they wrong?
Who?
This Israeli reading that the Arab world, the official Arab world, and the Islamic world is basically capitulated.
The difference is, and this is where we get to it. The difference is that, and this is where we get to the American project, that as far as I'm concerned, both Hezbollah and Hamas are still poking in their eye. They have not surrendered. So these projects that require total surrender, and you have Hezbollah and you have Hamas that have not totally surrendered. So what do you do with them? Let's say they were to totally surrender, then you would have a different project, right? It would be a different thing. There would be a different year or two. The Arab world, the Islamic world will readily accept Israel and sign on to them and accept whatever it is, reconstruction, whatever it is that Trump wants to do. They'd be very happy to do that. They're very happy to move on. The Gulf Arabs, the others, are very, very happy to move on. They just, the idea of genocide in Gaza is simply a constraint. It's a domestic constraint. It's not so much a foreign policy. It's a domestic constraint. They have issues, not so much the UAE, for example, but a lot of the other countries in the Gulf. They have an issue. There is an issue. So they need to get beyond that. Hamas and Hezbollah not surrendering totally creates this kind of this what is an opportunity as far as Israelis are concerned to continue to push, but a kind of a pain in the ass for the American project, which just wants to have total control, but needs these pockets to be taken out. In other words, I think that as far as America, Tom Barak, Trump's envoy, etc., they say it over and over and over. They're okay to have, if Hezbollah disarms and they kind of reintegrate a little bit into the political system, they'll go along with that. The Israelis won't. They require the utter destruction of that. Not just Hezbollah, the military, but Hezbollah, the political party, Hezbollah that has control over the Shia population, all this kind of stuff.
And by the way, it's for our listeners especially, this is worth putting into a somewhat larger historical or longer historical context. In the 1990s, when the Israelis were up to the early 2000s, when they were negotiating the so-called two-state solution with the corrupt and broken down Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Arafat first and then Mahmoud Abbas, they could easily have had a peace deal then, the Israelis, right? Palestinians would have, not the people, but the PA or the PLO would have accepted that archipelago of little islands of disconnected bits and pieces of land in the West Bank. And
so would a lot of people in the West Bank.
Let me make my point. My point is that they had a so-called partner in peace, even though peace wasn't really peace, it was submission. They had people willing to go along with it. Abbas would have signed anything they told him to sign. He would have said, sure, whatever, give me whatever scraps, and I'll take it. The people will resist, but whatever. But the point is, they didn't do that because there's something in them that just says, no, we want more. We want more. We always want more. They can't. I don't think that for me, that was a real turning point. And even people like the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert said in I think 2006, he said this: we've lost the chance. We had a chance where we could have had the idea of a Palestinian state that's not really a state. It's these disconnected blips and blobs of territory, an archipelago of disconnected little Gazas, basically, plus Gaza itself. And then they just said, no, we want more. And he kept saying, we're going to defeat ourselves because we're not able to know when enough is enough, and just say, look, we could have had what we wanted, which is an exclusive Jewish state. That's really what this is about. But
so that's the question. So you're saying, so just to be clear, you're suggesting, Sadi, and Karim, I think, is agreeing with you, that Israeli overreach and hubris, basically, right, and a commitment to this ethno-religious nationalist project is going to ultimately sort of has already destroyed the possibilities of a so-called two-state solution, that as ephemeral as it was even back in the 1990s, that's gone, you're saying, Sadi, right? And so therefore, all that's left before them is apartheid or extirpation of the Palestinians, correct? Ethnic cleansing.
Yeah,
it's either apartheid or ethnic cleansing.
From their point of view,
that's essentially what
that's their drive.
From their point, yeah,
and their society back. We know this now. All those polls show this, right? Their society back.
But you're suggesting, so that's on the one hand. On the other hand, Karim is saying that the official Arab and Islamic world, and not just the official, frankly, a lot of people around the world just want to move on. They want to be done with this, correct? Especially in the Arab world and in the Islamic world. Is that not what Karim is also saying? So there's two things working at cross purposes.
Yes, exactly. There's a contradiction there. If the Gulf states,
can you just elucidate what the contradiction is?
Yes, the Gulf states and the U.S. and the real estate tycoons and the Witkoffs and all the Kushners and all these people, they just want it sort of tamped down so they can make their deals and make their money. They just need it tamped down to a certain extent. The Israelis can't just tamp down. There's a constant drive internally to their society to do more. As I said, the early 2000s so-called peace process was the case in point. They could have had, all they had to do is say, fine, we recognize this Palestinian state that's not really a state. We're done. They would have gotten the whole Western world off their backs. We recognize Palestine. There is a two-state solution. There is a peace. It wouldn't have been a peace and it wouldn't have been a state, but they would have just been done. They would have finished. They would have gone on with what really matters to them, which is colonizing 60%, because that's what the so-called peace plan in the early 2000s, the so-called Camp David agreement, gave them 60% of the West Bank. But they wanted all of the West Bank. They never know when enough is enough. And I think we're going to see a contradiction because they're going to keep doing what they do. And so, and this is the other thing. The Western states, and I'd like Kareem's take on this too, the Western states that in the fall, through the summer and into September, were rushing over themselves to recognize this thing called the State of Palestine that doesn't exist. The reason why we've talked about this before, the reason why they were doing that was it was a cynical exercise to get their public pressure off their backs. Because people in the Western world were like, what is going on here? We can't go on supporting this. We have to stop, etc. So the Western states said, okay, we'll recognize the State of Palestine. That'll just get this pressure off our backs. Now they're saying the same thing, by the way. Now they're all saying, because there's a peace deal, we no longer need to impose sanctions. Gianni Infantino of FIFA was there. I don't know why he was there, but he was there in Egypt, saying we no longer need to exclude Israel from FIFA and UEFA because there's a peace deal, that everything's going to be okay, etc. And so they're trying to paper over the cracks. And the problem with the Israelis is
whitewash the genocide.
And whitewash,
right?
of course, they're going to try. They want to do that,
said,
but the Israelis won't stop. They won't let they're going to keep splattering blood on the whitewashing. That's the problem with the Israelis.
I agree, but I was expecting you to push back on what I was saying earlier on the slight divergence between an American project and the Israeli project, which is where you usually disagree, and you tell me it's a pure, dog and tail kind of situation. Do you see my point that there's a slight difference? Let me just, there's a couple of things that recent things that just came out. Did you see, I haven't seen it all, but I was looking at the transcript of Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff on their 60 Minutes, and maybe we can link it somewhere. Maybe Sina can link it somewhere. It's worth looking at. And it's of course all about, here are the two main diplomats, the two main peacemakers for this region. And a lot of course, as you might imagine, a lot of what they say is saying, we need to focus on bringing peace to the region. We need to do ceasefires. We need to do, bring humanitarian aid to people that have been suffering, even in Gaza. And so I'm looking at the transcript. It says, we need to bring, this is Jared Kushner saying, sincerely, we needed a way to bring humanitarian aid to people. And then we had to write all these complex words to deal with the 50 years of stupid word games that everyone in the region is so used to playing. Both sides wanted the objective, and we just needed to find a way to help everyone get there. This is the American narrative. We have also Tom Barak, as I said, I referenced him as the special envoy, Trump's special envoy to Syria, and he's also, I think, the ambassador to Turkey. And he wrote this kind of long, ridiculous personal perspective that he puts on Twitter. Again, I think Sina can link it. And he says, Osama, you should respond to this. He says, it's a very long, ridiculous thing, but one of the things he says, he starts out by saying, October 13, 2025 will be remembered as a defining moment in modern Middle East diplomacy. In Sharm el-Sheikh, world leaders did more than celebrate the release of hostages, etc. They gathered to endorse Trump's bold 20-point vision for renewal, reconstruction, shared prosperity across the region. Under his leadership, Arab, Muslim, Western nations joined in a single endeavor to replace a paralysis with progress and isolation with inclusion. For the first time in a century, some of this is for you, a genuine consensus emerged, an understanding that the Middle East, long divided by tribe and faith and scarred by colonial legacy, could now weave a new tapestry of cooperation. So the idea is to take this Gaza, this is all around the Gaza ceasefire thing, and with the Jared Kushner and Witkoff, they're all doing this kind of charm offensive to say this is going to, this is sort of going to kickstart the whole, and yet another Middle East, yet another new world order, yet another way. And of course, this is all signaling their intent to try to bring the Gulf guys back in, the kind of larger Arab Islamic world, in which there'll be a shitload of money and reconstruction and things to go. The problem is, I think, under this project, is that the Israeli tendency to screw things up and attack and kill and genocide and invade and attack would screw that up. It screws that particular thing up. And I think it's important to make that distinction. So do you guys agree with this, or I feel like there's no pushback, which is a bit strange?
No,
No, no.
Yeah, go ahead, Osama.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, what I mean, as I just said, it's the first time I see this tweet by
It's a long missive.
by Barak.
It's just he put it in
whatever the missive by Barak. I mean, it's like imperial hubris plus ChatGPT rolled out in the 2025 to tell us that yet again these sort of course this is absurd. That's not the way history works. I mean, this is just imperial hubris in a moment of where the colonialists feel triumphant, basically in the Middle East. Now, the only thing I take from that whole missive is the fact that Syria is, and that's the only thing we should be discussing, not the ridiculous, absurd idea of an imperial sort of a Pax Americana, but really the idea of whether or not Syria, and Kerim, you would know more than me about this, whether or not Syria is next in line to sign an official accord with Israel, an Abraham-type accord with Israel, in which the Golan Heights, of course, will be surrendered, and there will be some kind of, and that will just finalize and formalize where we are right now. I think that's really the question, and everything else is sort of.
Can I respond?
No, just 1 second, because this, to connect to the Tom Barak thing, in case you didn't see it, he says in this missive of his. He's going on, saying, okay, new this, that. Then his focus is on saying there's Syria, the missing piece of peace, and the stupid play on words, which is kind of annoying. And he goes on about Syria, etc. And yes, basically they're gearing up for some kind. It doesn't have to be a full-on peace treaty at this point. I think they understand they have to do this in stages, security guarantees, this kind of stuff, opening up. But eventually, it's sort of paving the way for Abraham Accords style thing. Although Abraham Accords has nothing to do with the neighbors. I mean, that's a separate issue. But basically, not so much Abraham Accords, but more basically peace treaty of some kind. We don't know what the terms are, but definitely moving in that direction. And Ahmed al-Sharaa is quite a pragmatic guy, and he understands that if he doesn't play ball now, at least, the Saudis, the Gulf won't reconstruct, won't send in the money, and the Americans will never kind of end their siege and all the pressure that they have placed on Syria over the past decade plus. The second part of that, he talks about Lebanon, the second frontier, and this is where he goes on about he says earlier this year the United States offered the quote unquote one more try plan, a framework for phased disarmament, Hezbollah, verified compliance and economic incentives under USA and France supervision. Lebanon declined to adopt it due to Hezbollah representation influence in the government, kind of thing. And so, we're in this thing, we're saying there is this unfolding thing. There are two, we're getting Hamas under control through this, they're hoping. Syria is kind of beginning to join the fold. Ahmed al-Sharaa was in the UN, was in New York, dealing with all sorts of meetings on the side. And now you have Lebanon, which is causing a problem. And a lot of people in Lebanon understand that this is a pretext that the Israelis may kind of increase their attacks, and we may end up in another kind of war, which I wouldn't surprise me in the least bit.
I mean, let me come in here on 2 points. First of all, about what Karim is calling the American project. I don't think that there is an American project. I don't think that there is, not just in the Middle East, in the U.S. itself.
Trump project. Trump project. American meaning Trump project.
I know, but we've talked on this show in the past, we've talked about there being a kind of American project that is an American state project of some kind. What Donald Trump represents is the end. Whatever it was already in crisis. It's been in crisis for a long time. But Donald Trump is a symptom of the termination, basically, of something called an American project that has a state logic, a state reason, an ideological commitment of some kind that's driven by state apparatuses. What Trump is doing is he's getting rid of anybody who doesn't agree with him personally. And he personally doesn't have, we've said this many times, Trump has no ideology. Trump is all about Trump. His only commitment is to himself. And so I don't think we could talk about an American state project or state reason or, Staatsräson or anything. I don't think that they have a state project that they're following anymore because Trump has removed the people who used to pursue that state project. They call them the deep state. They're hollowing it out. Look at the people he sent to the Middle East. Kushner is his son-in-law. Witkoff is like his real estate buddy from New York. These are personal connections.
These are not.
Tom Barak was another real estate guy he knows from New York. These are not. It's not that I have any faith in professional diplomats, clearly, because look at the damage they've done over the years. But these people are not. They're not.
The Oslo crew were okay. They were not real estate magnates. They didn't necessarily profit in terms of real estate, but they profited in all sorts of other ways, and were,
yes,
as you mentioned earlier, were extremely destructive in that phase of the 1990s, which was a different context. But they were as destructive in the 90s as these guys are now. Just a different kind of way.
There's a big difference, because in those days, they were representing an American state. You could say that the American state project had been hijacked, as I would say, by the Israelis. But there is no longer an American state project. There is Trump and his associates, and they're out for their personal interests. So, as I said before, if what Kushner's trying to do now is to rein the Israelis in, it's not because he cares about an American project.
Sorry, but just so that you're not misunderstanding my mind, I never said that he's caring. No, please, just because this needs to be clarified. I don't say at all that the American project is caring for people. No,
I'm not. No, sorry, I'm not saying
the Trump project is stability because they need to make money and they need to appease the Gulfies. This is important for him. His personal connection. Kushner made billions and billions of dollars in the Gulf. The Gulf need the Israelis to stop being genocidal. That's why they moved after the Israelis attacked Qatar. Even for Kushner and these kinds of people, there was a red line that was crossed. Their business interests, their personal interests superseded their support for the Israelis in that moment.
Okay, so let's agree then. This is not an American project per se. It's a project of a coalition of real estate magnates who have money to make, basically.
Fine, but channeled through official American.
Because they've.
But Sadi and Karim, but basically,
sorry, just one more piece to this, Osama, one more piece, which is that the so-called peace plan itself, from like clause 1, is unworkable. In other words, what they've concocted. What they've concocted is not something on the basis of which they can then make business deals with their Gulf friends.
I agree.
It's that it's worse even than the Camp David thing or than Oslo, because basically it calls for the Palestinians to essentially to negate themselves. And it says it's all like much more than Oslo. It's all, this will happen if the Israelis say, yes, it's okay, we can go to the next stage. And if this and if that and if this and if that, there's 100 conditions that they built into it.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, why don't we look at the agreement?
I'm not looking at the agreement. I'm saying that in their mind, the agreement is all about the first thing, which is you get to ceasefire. And then as long as Israelis don't continue genocide as such, as long as it gets off the front pages, as long as you don't ban the Israelis from FIFA and UEFA and this kind of stuff, you get them off the ICC, you get them off those main headlines. They don't really care what goes on. You need that. The Gulf people need that for the stuff to continue. They don't care about stage 2 and 3 and 10 and 15, but what they require from the Israelis is to stop genocide.
I agree with Karim, and I agree. I mean, you mean to slow the genocide down,
to get it off the front pages, to get it off the front pages,
to get off the front pages. So the real question is not just that the Gulf states and the Arab states and the Islamic world, the official Islamic world, is sort of relieved at the so-called ceasefire, even though Palestinians are being killed and still being harmed every single day. But really the question of the pressure that's going to be diffused on Western European states and leaders, correct? That's really what this is about. So no more discussion of banning Israel from FIFA, correct? Or UEFA. Karim, wasn't this that was coming up for discussion? And that has been now sort of, I think, indefinitely postponed.
I think that's
the same for the Eurovision.
Yeah, but I think that's a minor thing as far as what Trump and the Americans and the Israelis are concerned. I think I
don't think it's minor for the Israelis. I think maybe for Trump it's minor. I don't think it's minor for the Israelis at all.
I mean, for the peace, this deal that Sadi's talking about, they didn't do this deal because they're worried about UEFA or FIFA. That's a European concern within their own constituents. Yeah, I agree. And something the Israelis care about.
EU is the largest trade partner of of Israel.
Yeah, but that was never really threatened. They were never really going to do anything about that. I just don't think they were ever. The Europeans have no backbone. I think we know that. There's a couple of countries, the Irish, the Spanish, these things that have been very good. But even they, if you look closely at what Spain, I'm still not convinced that Spain cut off all its, all the aid and all the ties and all the things coming through. Even I need to check, but definitely Spain and Ireland and Norway to an extent. These countries were much better than other countries, But as a whole, the EU didn't really do anything. They didn't like the famine. They hated the idea that they were being dragged into this thing where Palestinian children were dying of starvation. They couldn't take that. But again, this is why all this stuff is there this deal, all that stuff is there to control the media image. It's there to control the story that had gotten out of control despite the tight holding. So we see two things going on. The one front is this peace deal stuff, which brings the genocide off the front pages. It appeases the Gulf Arabs and the Islamic world, frankly. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, you have the kind of the insidious plans that Netanyahu and these guys went to America and they said, okay, now we need to deal with TikTok. We need to even go even further when it comes to the social media crackdowns. We need to push further with the domestic laws. You see in the UK today, they arrested the Palestinian doctor, the NHS doctor, because of some protest she went to. They literally sent the police over to her and arrested her. It's beyond belief. An actual doctor, NHS. So those laws, they're pushing those domestic laws in the West, as you know, in your campuses and in domestic laws. They're going to tighten the control. You see the guy who bought CBS News and put Barry Weiss, and is buying CNN, and they're buying TikTok, and all that stuff is happening. On the other hand, this peace thing is there to appease the Arabs and the Arab states and the Islamic states and all of that. This is the plan now. The Israelis, to go back to my original point, and I'll stop here, and I agree with Sarah on this. The Israelis won't be able to help themselves. They cannot go along with that. I'm sure the Israeli businessmen do, and some of the Israeli army people do, but the core of these guys, they will not allow that. They will cause a problem. They will attack Iran. They will attack Lebanon. They will continue the genocide. They will not have any way to stop, because the downside of all the stuff with the Americans is that in the end, they don't really have a way to really punish the Israelis. They lean on them from time to time, but they certainly don't punish.
I'm sorry. It was a very
long-winded.
No, it was interesting. But what is it? I'm trying to understand what is the point you're making, in terms of like where we're going, because we should wrap soon. We've been going for an hour almost. Where do you think this is going exactly? And then Sadi, maybe you can have the final word. And then Karim, you're saying that there's no incentive to stop the Israelis, and the Israelis cannot, you're saying, stop themselves, correct? As a state structure.
What I'm saying, just to summarize, is there is a so-called peace plan that's supposed to also expand to Lebanon and Syria, as per Tom Barak and all these, Jared Kushner, all these people. The details aside, I don't think it'll work, but that's their plan. And on the other hand, you have this kind of crackdown in social media, etc. That's going to increase. But you have this Israeli project that is going to undermine even those that are trying to save Zionism, the Europeans, the Americans, because they're trying to save the Israelis, they're trying to save Zionism from themselves. They will sabotage themselves. They will continue it. They will undermine all of this, all of which is being done in order to save the Israelis themselves. They're not there to save Hamas or Hezbollah or the Lebanese or the Palestinians. That's my point.
No, yeah, that's clear to me. I mean, obviously, I know that neither the U.S. nor the EU cares ultimately about the Palestinian people. That's quite clear. We've had decades and decades to witness of that. But what you're saying is that ultimately you're saying that the Israelis are going to sabotage themselves, and they're going to sabotage their supporters in the West who are going out of their way to correct. Isn't that what you're saying?
Yeah, the Israelis are going to be Israelis. The Israelis are going to be Israelis. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And Sadi, what do you think on this point? I mean, do you agree with Karim? So, I mean, so when you say the Israelis are, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, in other words, the Israelis are going to continue expanding. How, given the lack of any kind of restraint on them and the lack of any kind of, and their sense of impunity, why would they do anything but that? I guess is where we come back. We keep coming back to the same point over and over.
The Gulf is a restraint. Money is a restraint. The Gulf, Trump's plan to try to get the Gulf in requires the end of genocide, requires a basic sense of stability. Not the little things, not the surveillance, not the drones, not to kill 3 people and 5 people and 10 people. I don't think the Gulf people care about that. The Gulf states care about that, or the Egyptians or anybody else for that matter. But they require the end of the large scale stuff. That's how I see it.
You've said that. You've said that. Sadi, what do you think? And we'll wrap with you, Sadi.
Well, I mean, I think Karim and I fundamentally agree that no matter what anybody else wants, the Israelis are not capable of stopping. And as I said before, the clearest evidence of that is 2000s, when they had a Palestinian leadership that was willing to sign anything. Israel could have dictated the terms under which they would recognize a so-called Palestinian state that wasn't really a state. And they would have been done. There would have been a two-state. They would have been done with the question of Palestine. Not really, but I mean, it's in terms of getting the Western states off their backs.
Are there consequences for not stopping?
Yes, and this is my point. What the European states, what FIFA wants, and organizations, people like that, what they want is for the Israelis just to calm down a little bit, and just keep it ticking over, kind of like in the West Bank. So it's not. So it is outrageous, of course, to us as human beings, but to them, it's like as I said, it's below the threshold beyond which their publics will start agitating again. So as you said, Western publics have been, in my estimation, I've written a whole book about this. The state of Israel could not exist, historically or in the future or in the present. It could not exist without the well-being and support of Western publics. That well-being and support is gone. The Israelis used it up in the past 2 years. It's all gone now. So they need to find some way to coerce continued support from Western states and Western publics. I think they're going to have a much harder time being able to do that, because Western publics are watching. And now as we've talked about, the opinion polls in the Western world showing a dramatic loss of support for Israel and its state project and so forth. So I think what that means is, if the Israelis can manage to tamp it down to keep things below a certain threshold, that will slowly diffuse the pressure on Western states, on FIFA, UEFA, all the push for boycotts and divestments and so forth. And then they can make a peace deal, and there's money to be made, and Kushner will be happy, and all this stuff will happen, the Gulf, and all this will happen. I don't think the Israelis are capable of staying below a certain threshold. I think they always want more. And that, again, the 1990s proved that to us. They always want more. And so they're going to push, they're going to keep doing, they're going to keep, and if I was just looking at, again, as you guys were talking, that the script of the agreement, it's completely unworkable. I mean, what the Israelis have, and the other thing is that even though it's a Trump peace plan, you can tell it was written by the Israelis, because the word terror is in every other paragraph. That's not something the US would do. So it's an unworkable plan that, as I said, has baked into it 100 conditions that the Israelis are uniquely in a power of saying, well, okay, now we've passed this phase, we can move to the next phase. They determine at every step whether we go on to the next thing or not. And if we don't, they can go back to full-scale bombardment. So my personal sense is that the Israelis can't help themselves. They're going to be what they've always been, which is this never stopping, never knowing when enough is enough. And that's going to, even though we have a temporary hiatus, and it's good for people in Gaza for as long as it lasts, they can breathe, they can recoup, they can hopefully get some aid, whatever. Hopefully that will happen. But the Israelis they're just going to, Ben Gvir is still there, Smotrich is still there, the Israeli coalition is still there, Netanyahu is still there. The demonstrated support of the Israeli public for this genocide is still there, 80-90% support consistently. I was just writing about it this morning, poll after poll after poll. It's clear. So how's that going to end? I think they're going to keep going, and then Western publics, again, who are the single biggest threat to Israel's security in the future, will cause their governments to change. I think that's why in the long run, I think the Israelis are in trouble, because they can't help themselves. That's my sense of it.
I guess we should stop here on that note, and let's see how this long run comes to unfold. Thank you, Karim, and thank you, Sadi.